Hi, my name is Brianna Schro, and I am a doctoral student at the University of Arizona studying special education with an emphasis in learning disabilities. This week, I'm here to talk to you about specific learning disabilities and response to intervention, also known as RTI. The definition of a specific learning disability is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written. Children who have an SLD often have problems in their ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, and work on mathematical calculations. In order for a child to be determined to have a specific learning disability, they must show inadequate progress in one or more of these 8 areas or categories. And we have 3 main categories which fall under communication, reading, and math. And within those, we have our 8 specified areas: oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skill, reading fluency skills, reading comprehension, math calculation, and lastly, math problem solving. It was not until 2004 that reading fluency was added as an area of underachievement for determination of SLD. For those of you who are not sure what reading fluency is or what it encompasses, I've provided a little piece here for you. Fluency includes accuracy, so not only how accurate the student can read the words, but are they making a lot of errors, the rate, how fast, and the prosody, meaning their expression. Are they, if it's an exclamation mark, are they showing that in their voice? If someone's excited, are they also showing that? So basic things that maybe you and I, or someone who's used to reading, might get without having to think about. Reading fluency is also an area I'm really passionate about. So if you have any questions in addition to this presentation, especially on reading fluency, please let me know, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. We also want to make sure that the underachievement of the student is not the primary result of any of the following. I'm going to talk to you about it. First, we have visual, hearing, or a motor disability. So if our student has a visual impairment, they're not able to see very well, a hearing impairment, maybe deafness, meaning that your child is severely impaired in processing linguistic information through hearing, and they either need amplification or maybe they use sign language to communicate. We also have children who are deaf-blind, meaning they not only have a problem with a visual impairment, they also have a hearing impairment. Students with a motor impairment. We also have mental retardation, which means they have below average general intellectual functioning, but we call this intellectual disabilities now. But a lot of people are slow to move over on the change for that. We also have emotional disturbance, which includes schizophrenia. The term, however, does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted unless it is determined that they have an emotional disturbance. Cultural factors, environmental or economic disadvantage, are those with limited English proficiency. Maybe their first language is not English, or they're from another country, or perhaps maybe they speak Spanish at home and they don't use English very much. But either way, in order for a student to be classified as having a specific learning disability, their underachievement cannot be the result of any of these categories. We also need to make sure that the student's underachievement is not due to the lack of appropriate instruction. basically meaning that the student's not getting the instruction they need in their general classroom. So in order to show that this is not the case, we need to make sure we have data prior to the referral of the student. And we want to make sure the student was provided with appropriate instruction in the general education setting. We usually want that to be evidence-based practices, so research-based that backs it up. We also want there to be assessments of the student that are ongoing. So we want to make sure they're repeated, we want to make sure they're valid, and we want to make sure they're taken at reasonable intervals for the student. So for instance, we're not assessing the student the first month in August when they start school and then again in May, and that's all the assessment they get. We want to make sure our assessment is ongoing. So a great way for assessment that a lot of schools are moving to, which we've talked about before, is CBM, curriculum-based measurement. So, for a child suspected of having a specific learning disability, we have to have documentation for them. And in their documentation for eligibility, to see if they qualify or not, we need to make sure there are 7 different elements. And I'll go through each of these with you. The first documentation is, we need to know, did the child have a specific learning disability or not? And number 2 kind of follows number 1. We want to make sure the basis for making the determination that whoever decided that the child has a specific learning disability was a qualified professional. We want that assurance that a qualified professional determined that the child has a specific learning disability. And what we mean by qualified professional, we're usually talking about a school psychologist that's testing the student. Number 3, relevant behavior, if any, noted during observation of the child and the relationship of that behavior to the child's academic functioning. So another requirement for a student that's being referred for special education is that they need to be observed in their classroom environment. We also need to have documentation of that observation, and if there's any relevant behavior during that observation, we want to make sure it's included in the documentation for the student. Number 4, if there's any educationally relevant medical findings. Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. It just depends on the situation. And number 5, we want to know whether the child is not achieving adequately for not only their age, but also their state-approved grade level standards. So basically, they're not making sufficient progress to meet not only their age, but also the state-approved grade level standards. Next, number 6, the group. And here we mean the group, we mean the multidisciplinary team that got together to look at the students' files and put together documentation. We need to make sure that their underachievement does not fall into any of the 6 areas we talked about previously. And lastly, number 7, that the child has participated in a process which assesses his or her response to scientific research-based intervention. So we want to make sure they're getting that adequate instruction. We want to make sure it's also research-based. So with that, we have 2 options available for identifying students who have learning disabilities. The first one is the IQ Achievement Discrepancy Model. This will also often be referred to as the discrepancy model. You can use them either way. Just be aware what it stands for. The next one is Response to Intervention, RTI. We will talk about this in more depth, but you'll also find more information in your reading for Response to Intervention. So first off, what is the IQ Achievement Discrepancy Model? Some of you might know about it, some of you may not, but I hope that you will take away with this knowing exactly what it is and hopefully being able to convey to others what it is as well. So the IQ Achievement Discrepancy Model is an approach we traditionally use in schools to identify children with learning disabilities. In this, we assess whether there is a significant difference between a child's IQ and their achievement. And we usually use this with different tests and assessment. So the example I gave here is a test of general intelligence, which is by the WISC, which stands for the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, and then scores obtained on achievement tests, such as the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement Test. So, if we have a student and we're looking at their scores, a student's score on the IQ test often has to be at least 2 standard deviations, that would be 30 points higher than his or her scores on the achievement test. Therefore, the student that I just described would have a significant discrepancy between their IQ and their achievement, and therefore they would have a specific learning disability. And we need to figure out what that specific learning disability is. So, in this figure, I have for you an example. So, this student, let's call her Mary. Mary has an IQ score of 100, and she's not doing very well in reading in her class, so her teacher referred her. Her reading score was a 68. So if we look at her IQ score versus her reading score, there is a large discrepancy between 68 and 100. It's at least 2 standard deviations higher. Her IQ is at least 2 standard deviations higher than her score on reading for achievement. So in this situation, we need more information, but using our IQ achievement discrepancy model, it's most likely that Mary is going to have a specific learning disability in reading, and then we need that specific area it's going to be in. Also, the IQ achievement discrepancy model has a lot of concerns for schools and how we identify students. So this method doesn't allow schools to identify children as having learning disabilities while they're still in the primary grades. So students often struggle for years prior to being identified as having a learning disability with this model. Also, students do not receive the support they need in the early grades. And then lastly, the information gathered from the IQ and achievement assessments does not indicate each student's specific learning needs. So the assessment provides little that informs us about our classroom instruction. It is also unable to provide information about whether classroom instruction is currently meeting the student's need. So whatever Mary's reading teacher is doing, we're not able to look at that with our IQ achievement discrepancy model. And so the IQ achievement discrepancy model can create inequitable treatment for students. And in a little bit, we'll talk about some disadvantages in addition to the ones I also mentioned. So response to intervention, also known as RTI, is an approach that is an alternative to the IQ achievement discrepancy model for identifying students with learning disabilities. What is RTI? Well, basically, it's a multi-tiered process to enable early identification and instruction. And intervention is based on scientific research for all students. So we're not just willy-nilly here pulling out information that we think might be good. We're using research, we're using facts, we're using things that have been researched and are working for others. That's why it's scientifically based and evidence-based. There's 3 tiers of service instruction. So we have Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. It also provides universal screening for all students. So in Tier 1, all students receive effective, research-validated instruction in the general education setting, and progress is monitored weekly. In Tier 2, students whose progress is less than desired receive different or additional support from the classroom teacher or another educational professional, like a special education teacher. Also, like Tier 1, students are monitored on an ongoing basis in Tier 2. Our next tier is Tier 3, and students whose progress is still insufficient in response to our Tier 2 will receive even more intensive instruction, which can be provided in a variety of ways. From here, it depends on the state's or district's policies. Students may qualify for special education services based on progress monitoring data, or they may receive either an abbreviated or comprehensive evaluation for the identification of a learning disability. For struggling students, though, there are 4 benefits of using an RTI approach. Number 1, we have early intervening for students who are struggling. We're not waiting for students to fail like the IQ discrepancy model does, and fewer students are struggling before receiving help. Number 2, it represents a more valid method for identifying students with learning disabilities. Number 3, prevents substantial reading difficulties from developing. And lastly, number 4, we're reducing inappropriate referrals and placements in special education for students with learning disabilities. So let's look at the problems with the IQ achievement discrepancy model. I mentioned some earlier, but let's address some of them now. So it's not practical or accurate for young children because some achievement and intelligence tests cannot really grasp young students and where they are exactly. Like I said, it's a wait to fail method. So we're waiting for the student to fail to have that discrepancy between their achievement and their IQ in order for them to qualify. We're not helping them before that happens. We also don't consider the error of testing that might occur. And it's time consuming for the testing, not only for the school psychologist or whoever is giving the test, but also the student to have to miss class and be tested. Then we have problems with RTI, response to intervention. So RTI does not clearly differentiate between learning disability students and other students we might consider underachievers. It also will likely identify virtually all slow learners as someone with a learning disability, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And there's no formal means of cognitive processing built into this process. So for instance, in our IQ achievement discrepancy model, we're testing students with validated measurements like the WISC or the Woodcock-Johnson. In RTI, we're not doing that. We don't have that cognitive evaluation. Another problem with RTI is that it can be inappropriately influenced by those who want the student to be identified. So let's say a parent, let's say a teacher, let's say a principal. They could be inappropriately influencing our results, and they want that student to be identified, as it is a little easier to be identified with learning disability in the RTI method, as you don't have to have that discrepancy between your achievement and your IQ. So, you should remember that there are 4 components of RTI. Even though we have 3 tiers, the first one is technically universal screening, or a screening assessment we administer to all students in class to see where they're at. Tier 1 is considered class or school-wide interventions. Tier 2 is targeted interventions. And then lastly, Tier 3 is intensive individualized interventions for those students that just weren't responding in Tier 1 or Tier 2. And so 2 types of assessment are used in RTI. Universal screening, which I've said a few times. So universal screening basically helps determine students that may be struggling with reading skills. Each school has different decisions to make regarding universal screening related to how often we screen the student, selecting the screening measure, and criteria we use to determine which students are needing further intervention. Our next type of assessment we use in RTI is progress monitoring. So progress monitoring is important because it informs our decisions about the students. It informs our decision about the intensity of their instruction, and do they perhaps need to move up on another tier of RTI. So something new is something we call a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And we are really trying to move to a pattern of strengths and weaknesses instead of an IQ achievement discrepancy model and instead of RTI. So there is a provision in IDA regulations for a third way to identify students with learning disabilities. and that is the pattern of strengths and weaknesses. This generally does use a cognitive evaluation, so that would counteract RTI that doesn't have a cognitive evaluation. So in order for a student to qualify under a pattern of strengths and weaknesses for LD identification, the student has to show a set number of cognitive strengths. It's usually 3, plus at least 1 cognitive weakness. So a positive about this, though, is we get to see where the student is having the problems. We don't have to go search further for it. So they have a pattern of strengths, and we have a pattern of weaknesses, and we can set out the instruction to help them. So personally, this is probably my favorite of them for identifying students with learning disabilities. So there's technically 3. Let's recap. The first one was an IQ achievement discrepancy model. The second one was response to intervention, RTI. And the third one, which is much newer, is a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. What each state and district uses depends upon what they decide. So you might have one district that's using an IQ achievement discrepancy, and you might have another that's using RTI, and you may have one that's using a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And it's possible these could all be in the same city. So just keep this in mind next time. So I hope you've enjoyed our presentation on the identification of children with specific learning disabilities, the components that students need to have in order to qualify for an SLD, and also the 2 options we use to identify students with specific learning disabilities, as well as the additional one that's starting to come into play more.